3, 2, 1.
Hey, welcome to the Vintage Vibe. Well, we've decided to mix things up here at the Vintage Vibe, not just with our system here today, but we're on a Philips kick all of a sudden with this, unobtainium Philips 578 amplifier, 572 preamplifier, and the matching tuner just being serviced right now. Now we're going to keep it on the Philips theme here today, I guess we're going to call it. And we're going to take a look at probably the most odd speakers you've seen, made by Philips, used to actually mix Pink Floyd's The Wall. Stick around for a cool episode on Philips 544 motion feedback speakers. Just a little smaller than these guys here. That's right, Andy Jackson, producer of The Wall, says that he mixed that album on Philips 544 electronic speakers. As he put it, you'd start with the big monitors, and then you'd mix down, to the little Philips. And these were revolutionary, kind of experimental speakers. And they used them, Pink Floyd, right up to Roger Waters' album, Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. And Andy Jackson will tell you they were not the easiest speakers to actually mix on. So you wonder why. Now, we'll talk about how these sound, and you might understand why possibly they decided to use them. And maybe it had something to do with the cool factor too. I'm not sure. I mean, here I am telling you about this, and I didn't listen to The Wall on the speakers. Bonkers. So Philips, as a manufacturer, let's start there before we dive into the speakers too deep. Philips as a manufacturer is really an electronics giant. So back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, they were making radios. And I say radios because, like at the beginning of the video, real radios glow. And Philips was known for console radios, tabletop radios, and they were, quite as I mentioned, a giant in the industry. And that spread out to appliances, that spread out to TVs, electric shavers, light bulbs, toasters, you name it. Philips probably made it. But somewhere in the 70s, I think Philips kind of got lost. And they were trying to figure out who they were. And you didn't really run to the, electronics store and buy yourself a Philips stereo if you had a bunch of money to spend on a stereo. You bought a Pioneer, you bought a Sansui, you bought a Technics, you did something like that. But Philips, not quite sure. Don't those guys make electric razors or something? They did make, though, a whole bunch of these experimental type speakers called motion feedback. And they were trying to kind of tackle a couple things. So you got Philips over there in the Netherlands, and you got Philips in the United States of America. So the American engineers decided that they were going to do something different because they were, kind of tired of making razors and shavers. And they took amplifiers and stuck them in small little speaker boxes. Interestingly enough, at that time, no one had really thought of doing that. No one was doing it, and no one really did it thereafter for years. And now, self-powered speakers, pick your poison. So these are kind of like LS50s that were powered, whatever model that is, the wireless ones, back in the 1970s. Only better sounding and kind of cooler looking. Wow, kind of brilliant if you think about it. So let's dive deep into these Philips RH-544s and talk about certainly some of the features, what you could expect to do in terms of service if you buy a pair, how much you can expect to pay if you can actually find a pair, and certainly how they sound. All that and a lot more here in the Vintage Vibe. This is a modest looking bookshelf speaker with a cool 70s vibe with the grill partially on, or if you like, you can go fully naked. It is completely up to you. Now, I was lucky enough to find these speakers with the matching preamplifier, which is quite rare.
Now I went out and I also acquired the tuner because I just wanted to make it all one happy family with the power amp I already had. But remember, these are self-powered, so the power amplifier was turned off and took a little slumber while we used the pre-outs on the preamp to power the speakers. And as you can see, they're quite busy on the back with all kinds of switches and buttons and gizmos and doodaddies to get them sounding just like you want them. Now, these were owned by a gentleman who worked for Philips, and they have two amplifiers in each, essentially 40 watts for the bass driver and 20 watts for the high frequency driver. The bass driver is 4 ohms, and the tweeter section is 8 ohm with relatively low distortion.
I went through that pretty quick, so I'm going to go back here for a second. So essentially 2 amplifiers in each speaker. We can look at it that way. And the bass driver is good for 40 watts of good, honest, clean power. And I can attest, it sounds much bigger than 40 watts, certainly. The bass driver is capable, as per Philips, to play down to 35 hertz. Now that is low, deep bass for a bookshelf speaker. In fact, even for a floor standing speaker. And it's crossed over the bass driver to 1,000 hertz. That's the highest frequency it plays to. The bass driver is a 4 ohm driver, and they rate the amplifier for 0.2% harmonic distortion, which might sound high when you think of some of the amplifiers at the time saying 0.000 whatever. But it's definitely not distortion that's going to be audible to us. It's probably a real world honest measure. Now, the tweeter section, a 20 watt amplifier. It's crossed over to start at 400 hertz and go to 20,000 hertz, which again, we'd kind of expect those type of measurements for tweeters of today.
And as for features, you have on-off switch, an automatic signal sensing switch that will trigger this to come on when the music comes on if you like, as well as a bunch of fuses and AC outlets and stuff. Now, there is a dial that we're going to see here that adjusts your high frequency of the tweeter, as well as input for the preamp.
What is so cool about that is this allows you for proper component matching between your preamplifier and the power amplifier, which is the speakers. I don't see this even in typically wireless speakers today. So picture this. I want to power these Philips speakers with my Philips preamp. I can go to the specifications page on the preamp and determine that it has a 1 volt output of signal, and I can select on the back of the speaker 1 volt input, and it matches the power amp with the preamp. Now let's say I decide I want to use my, I don't know, iPhone. If I knew what the output was of the iPhone from the little 1.5 millimeter jack, I can adjust the input sensitivity on the amplifier to match that source, or really any amplifier or preamplifier. This is what we strive to do with power amps and preamps today to get the correct match and gain so they sound right. This is something Philips thought of in the early 70s. Now, on the back of the speakers, as we've seen there as well too, just for connection, to give you an idea, you got a whole bunch of RCA jacks. You will essentially take your pre-out on your preamp, let's say, and put 2 RCA jacks into the input jacks on the speaker, left and right. You'll determine what speaker that is going to be that the RCA jacks went in. Let's say that's my left speaker. There's a button there that you can press that says left. Then you'll take another RCA and you'll run it from the output on that master speaker, let's say the right, and we're going to run that over to the right-hand speaker and plug it in into the input, which says right, and press the button on that speaker to identify it as the right speaker, which means you have the right signal, no pun intended, going to both speakers. I think they're really, really cool. A little awkward at first to set up, but once you kind of understand what they're doing, I mean, it's brilliant.
Now here's one with the RCAs hooked up, and I'm actually opening the back. The back door is on hinges. You can swivel it open to see all the mechanics inside. And that will include all kinds of capacitors and resistors. And as you can see a little bit further down below, a pretty large power transformer and some potentiometers to adjust the input like we were talking about. And the cabinet itself is quite sealed. You can see it's all glued and it's pretty well dampened. It certainly passes the knock test and is heavy. Now, when you turn it on, you get a little thump to tell you, "Hi, I'm here," and the light lights up. Now, if you don't listen to music for about 2 minutes and it's in auto sensing mode, that light will extinguish and you get a nice little thump again saying bye bye. And here's a close up of the dome tweeter with a little kind of wave guide. Look at that, eh? Old technology is new again. It's quite large of a dome, which is great for dispersion of sound. And this is what makes the speakers so special. You can see that bass driver with that very odd looking piezoelectronic accelerometer.
Did I say accelerometer? Bear with me here. This device actually has wires going from the amplifier to the accelerometer that senses the actual motion or movement of the bass driver, hence motion feedback speakers. What the engineers were trying to do was correct a phenomenon with bass drivers, with speakers in general. Because of inertia, when you have a bass note, let's say, the speaker extends outwards. By the time the next bass note might come, or whatever the signal may be, quite frankly, the speaker may not be in the correct positioning. And what they attempt to do with this accelerometer is measure where the speaker is in movement according to the music. And the amplifier will receive a signal back and it will adjust the gain to better control the speaker itself. Now, if that doesn't sound Star Trek-y, I don't know what else does.
Well, aside from these Schmidt Audio omnipolar speakers we're designing right now, but I can't share that with you yet. This is a secret. Well, let's wrap up talking about what you could expect for service, how much these will cost you if you can find them, and most importantly, how do they sound?
What can you expect in terms of maintenance with these things? Expect the unexpected. Remember, these are speakers with 2 amplifiers, one in each of them, let's say. And like any 40-year-old vintage amplifier, you could be due for some recapping as well as some other maintenance. And by looking at how complex the power amplifier sections look in these, it looks like if you had to do a restoration, it would be a lot of work. Now, mind you, relatively easy to get at the components, but whether you'd have the stomach to get into that or not is questionable. You'd likely need a good tech at the very minimal. Now, in terms of parts, if you had a blown output or if you had a bad accelerometer, forget about it. You're not finding likely the original components, and you'll never find the accelerometer anywhere unless you say, "Beam me up, Scotty," and you find one on the Starship Enterprise. As for resurrounding the speakers, if the rubber was to crack, it's like a butyl surround. Again, you would have to carefully disassemble these to not disturb those components we were just talking about, and I wouldn't want to be one to have to do it. Now, mine were in good condition. Aside from some noisy controls, I was losing one channel and I wasn't quite sure what it was. It turned out to be the switch on the back that adjusts right and left speaker. So expect, like a vintage receiver or amp, you're going to have to clean the controls, the switches, as well as the potentiometers, in the speakers. But again, very easy to service. A couple screws, open up the back, and you can get right at them. I mean, they're pleasurable to do that. I mean, one of the easiest I've ever had to do in terms of cleaning. What do they cost? I think you would have a hard time finding them for less than about 500 Canadian in 2023. I think on average, if somebody could pry them from the owner's fingers, you're probably paying between $600 and $650 likely for these. Part of it because the cool factor and the rarity. These are rare. How did they sound? Well, when I went to audition them, the gentleman was playing Donna Summers. Now, I'm not a big Donna Summers fan, but it sounded amazing. And I thought he was doing some sort of hoodoo voodoo, and I figured it probably wouldn't sound like that when I got home because it was just so jumping and lively. It was like a disco club in his living room, I was floored, especially since they were sitting almost on the ground, which is not ideal. You want these up a little bit, kind of at ear level like any other speakers. When I got them home and I plugged them in, I was equally surprised with how much tight bass there was. I can't say this enough. The bass is deep and it is tight, and it will absolutely shock you. You won't know where it's coming from. Now the mid-tweeter does a great job. It's got good dispersion. We got a nice sound stage. It's not over the top sound stage like spooky sound stage, but everything's positioned where it should be when you're listening to music. They definitely don't lack. I can see why they would be a pretty decent speaker, to say the least, to mix something like The Wall on. And I can also understand with that, think about Another Brick in the Wall, the bass notes when the song starts. I can imagine, and now I feel horrible that I didn't listen to that record through those speakers to recreate it, but I could just imagine the mixing process and the sound from those speakers after listening to them, and how cool that would have been to do. Now, when I got them upstairs and I put them in this room, this is the caveat. The bass was so deep, now not muddy, but just so deep that it was almost overpowering. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with positioning because there was just so much bass. So you have to take your time to position accordingly, knowing that they produce a lot of bass energy, these speakers, and tight bass energy. These are killer speakers for an office or for a studio or for wherever you do what you do. They certainly deserve a place in your vintage audio collection. I hope you enjoyed the review, and come back next time when we take a look at other obscure and interesting audio components. We'll see you next time. Oh, don't forget to like and subscribe.